What's going on, guys? Welcome to episode 64 of the Data Driven Strength Podcast. Today, we're going to be talking about maintenance volume. And you may have heard many other conversations on maintenance volume, maybe even some from us in the past, but this hopefully will be somewhat of a different spin on that conversation, going into the weeds a little bit more on the data or lack thereof that we have on maintenance volumes, how that applies, and more than just the typical populations that maybe the studies discussed are. We've written some stuff in the past on this, but I know Josh has done a deep dive on this research for some of his PhD stuff as well. So I'm excited for this conversation. Josh, how goes it? Today is Mr. Pellin's birthday, although I'm sure he doesn't want the listeners to know. But Josh is, 21 years old today. He can go out, have his first adult beverage.
Yeah.
He's excited.
Yeah, isn't 21 of cultural significance because it's also what 9 plus 10 equals? No, but last night I was like, dang, I officially cannot see anything without my glasses. Like over the last few years, I can do a good amount of things without my glasses. In fact, when I passed my driver's exam, which was somewhere around 10 years ago now, so that might reveal my age, I was able to pass my driver's exam without my glasses, but now absolutely no chance. I used to be able to do a good amount of things without my glasses. And last night it just really hit me. I didn't have my glasses on. I was trying to watch TV and I was like, I can't see anything. I can't read the subtitles. And so, yeah. And then I was like, all right, my birthday is tomorrow. So I guess this is what happens with old age. So yeah, that's how my birthday is going, man.
There you have it. I'm very much the same. My ability to see is massively declined in the past year or two. So you have only a rapid acceleration to look forward to.
Yeah, Zach's a little bit older than me, so hopefully I'm not on the same track. But all signs point to the fact that I am on that track. And my eyes aren't even that bad. Like, I don't know how eye prescriptions work. The contacts and glasses are it's like minus 1.5 to minus 2, which I don't think is that bad. I do have astigmatism, so I think that might yeah, I think you have one too. That might make it worse. Again, I have no idea how this stuff actually works, but some of my immediate family members, like I think my mom's is like -7 or -8. I can't even imagine that. I don't know if it's a linear thing. I don't know how much my stigmatism.
You got those bulletproof lenses, baby.
Literally. So yeah, it's pretty scary, man. Yeah, I would love to just be able to like not wear glasses, because especially in Florida when it's sunny all the time.
That LASIK, baby.
Yeah, that'd be really nice. That'd be really nice. I want to look into it. Have you looked into it?
I've been looking into experimental eye procedures for like multiple years now. We've talked about this before, but I have like pretty bad what are called floaters. So like it's basically like little black specks in my eyes at all times. Like any bright light, like there's like black like little threads basically are in my vision constantly. So I've been pretty deep in the ophthalmology research, looking for when that procedure gets to be no longer like extremely experimental. Like 50% of the cases, it's like completely clears like what I'm talking about, and then the other 50% of cases, it turns into like a billion different particles and makes it like completely worse. So so we're still holding out for now. But yeah, LASIK's cool.
I think experimental eye procedures are remarkably safe because you just do it in one eye. If you're good, you do it in the next eye. If the second eye gets screwed up, like you
got an eye patch. Worst case scenario,
worst case scenario is the first attempt doesn't work, and then you have one bad eye and one really bad eye. That's the worst case scenario. Which, could your eyes get much worse? Probably not. So it's really not all that bad. And I think, yeah. I mean, this may or may not be medical advice, but I think experimental eye procedures are remarkably safe compared to other operations that I can think of off of the top of my head. So yeah, that's it. I also treated myself to about 15 extra minutes of training today. I was like, you know what? I'm just going to train as long as I want today. And instead of, usually that session takes me like 45 minutes. I guess it was more like 20 minutes. It took me an hour and 5 minutes. So that was nice. check out one of our recent YouTube videos, talk a little bit how I make things very flexible, because sometimes I do, condensed training as short as like 15 minutes. Sometimes I'll let it expand a little bit over an hour, and took the high end of that today to treat myself, if you will. So if you're not subscribed to the YouTube channel, go ahead and do that. But with that, we can dive into today's podcast. Like Zach mentioned, we're going to be discussing maintenance volume, and I want to kick this off with two notes. The first is that keep listening, give this a shot, because it kind of sounds like a boring podcast topic, because who cares about maintenance? We want to get as jacked as possible. We want to get as strong as possible. Fair. But I think this is going to be quite practical and hopefully give you a perspective, even in terms of applying it towards quote unquote optimization type stuff.
Dude, I don't want to belabor this point too much, but like, I have grown to appreciate, particularly through my coaching experience, just like how much continuing to take baby steps forward at periods when that's like the only option is just so important for making continued progress. Like, man, I think that's just so underrated. Like, being able to know what to do in those periods of time is just like so key. So yeah, just doubling down on that. Didn't really hear you frame it that way when we were discussing off air. So that's just like, I wouldn't even view maintenance volumes as just like, it's just a different way of thinking about it. I guess it's like, to me, it's like very much a positive skill set rather than just like learning how to not go backwards. It doesn't make a lot of sense when I say it like that, but in my mind, my framing on this has changed substantially.
No, I think that'll resonate with a lot of people, right? And I think, if you're in the honeymoon phase of lifting, you might not be super interested in this sort of topic. But I think when you are 5 years in, maybe additional life responsibilities start to add up, the thought of, hey, how do I maintain during this time period? How do I take small steps forward? These things start to become more and more important. And then, obviously that's probably just amplified for us in terms of, working with folks with different values, different schedules, different preferences, et cetera. The second thing I wanted to note on the front end is we're going to frame this around muscle size. We'll probably discuss strength briefly a little bit. And I think a lot of this probably applies, at least in terms of directionality, to strength. But just for the sake of not making this, super complicated, and just, kind of streamlining things here, we'll kind of put that to the side for the most part. But if that is something you're interested in, leave a comment on YouTube, ask any specific questions you have, and we can absolutely consider that for the future. And hopefully this will be a little bit more interesting than just, how I think folks in the evidence-based circle tend to talk about maintenance volumes. I think people typically say like, oh, Bickle, I think it's 2011, you can maintain with 1/9 to 1/3 of your previous resistance training volumes. I think there's a lot more to it. I think that's a little bit short-sighted, and I'm not saying like anybody that said that before is like being intellectually lazy or missing something, but because we've definitely said that as well. But I think this topic probably deserves a little bit more nuance, and kind of peeling back the layers, if you will. So let me start this discussion around maintenance volumes for hypertrophy by stating the obvious, that training cessation, so stopping training, absolutely does lead to a loss in muscle mass. Now, obviously, training cessation for just, a couple days or maybe a week, maybe it's undetectable in that sort of scenario, but it's very well documented that extended time off of training absolutely does lead to a loss in muscle size. Again, this has been documented probably dozens of times, but I'll use an example of a study from Tavares and colleagues. So this is a 2017 study, and if you want to search it up, it's titled The Effects of Different Strength Training Frequencies During Reduced Training Period on Strength and Muscle Cross-Sectional Area. So this study basically had 33 untrained folks, and they trained with about 17 sets per week. And they trained both the Smith machine squat and the leg extension for 8 weeks. So they were previously untrained, but then they trained for 8 weeks, effectively making them like kind of trained for a couple months. And they saw pretty robust growth. It was in the ballpark of like 6.3%. of muscle growth. I think it was MRI. Yeah, pretty sure it was MRI, but nonetheless, pretty robust growth as you would expect. After that, the 33 participants were randomized to one of three groups. One group did not train for the second 8-week period, right? So 16 total weeks for these folks. First 8 weeks, they trained. Second 8 weeks, they did not train. Quadricep cross-sectional area, again, as measured by muscle size, decreased by about 4.7%. So this is kind of a bit of a sidebar, but it was kind of sad to see that they lost most of the gains that they initially made. Not quite all of their gains, but again, this is well documented that, hey, when you stop training, you lose muscle size. And the cool thing about this Tavares paper is that they had two other groups. And the two other groups reduced their workload for the second 8 weeks. These two groups, we're just going to kind of lump them together because they had the same dosage, the same volume across the weeks, but they just differed in frequency. So that leads us into our discussion about maintenance volumes, because the study looked at both training cessation in one group, and then in the two other groups, they looked at maintenance volumes, right, by basically reducing to right around 46% of previous volumes, going from about 17 on average to about 8 sets per week. So these groups did see a slight reduction in muscle size, but it wasn't significant. It was like, minus 1%, minus 2% from weeks 8 through 16. Wasn't significant, it's pretty small sample research. So I feel relatively confident saying that for the most part, these folks that reduced volume from 17 to 8 sets, more or less maintained their muscle size. Pretty recent study. And from what I recall, pretty, well reported, used MRI, all that good stuff. The next study I want to mention here, and I promise I'm not going to make this me just kind of, describing a bunch of studies in a row, but I'll hopefully kind of paint a picture here as I go. The next study is probably the best cited study on maintenance volumes, and that's a study from Bickel and colleagues. Again, if you want to search this one up, it's titled Exercise Dosing to Retain Resistance Training Adaptations in Young and Older Adults. So this had 70 participants that were previously untrained and then trained them for 16 weeks. So one of the primary strengths of this study is that it was a pretty long study overall. So 16 weeks training, and it was pretty high volume training. So it was 27 sets per week, split up, I believe, evenly between the leg press, the squat, and the leg extensions. Now, of the 70 participants, I believe around half of them were younger adults and around half of them were older adults. So I'm going to kind of mention the outcomes split between older adults and younger adults, because that's primarily how it was reported in the paper. Younger adults were 20 to 35 years old. Older adults were 60 to 75 years old. And after they took those 70 subjects and had them train for 16 weeks, they then randomized them into one of three conditions. One being detraining, the other being a reduction to 1/9 of their previous volumes, so 27 sets to 3 sets. And the final possibility to be randomized to was 1/3 of previous volume, so 27 sets to 9 sets. Let's start with the young individuals. I'd imagine that aligns a little bit more with the average demographic, but if you are closer to the older demographic, hang tight, we'll be right there. So basically, to sum it up, the reduction to 1/9 more or less maintained muscle size, measured via two means, one being mean fiber area from muscle biopsies of the vastus lateralis, and the other being from DEXA scans of the thighs. So they looked at thigh lean mass. So kind of nice to be able to confirm that, if you will, from multiple measures. Again, the nominal changes were slightly negative, but hey, 3 sets per week, they made really good gains over the first 16 weeks, and they were able to maintain most of those gains in younger folks. Pretty promising in terms of maintenance volumes there. And then, in fact, the group that reduced to 9 sets per week, so from 27 to 9, so 1/3 of maintenance volumes, they actually continued to grow, at least by some measures. From week 16 until the very end of the study, which was an additional 32 weeks. So from week 16 to week 48, I think my public math is mathing there. Their mean fiber area increased around 9%, which is pretty cool, right? I think that's pretty encouraging to see that, hey, pretty high volume training, drop it down to, I think what most people would say, low to moderate volume training. And these folks continued to grow. And again, that's a step above maintaining muscle size. Now, the DEXA thigh lean mass was basically right at like a 0% change. I put a little bit more stock in the direct measure of fiber size, but hey, that's what we often talk about on this podcast. It's just like things don't agree with each other. Everything is interesting, and that's why we're not, just going to kind of regurgitate the findings of one study and hold that up as gospel. But nonetheless, in the young folks, 9 sets per week, at minimum they maintained. At best, they probably saw some growth. And then 3 sets per week, I would say, at best maintained, and at minimum didn't lose as much as they would have if they stopped training. Now, for the older folks, things were a little bit less promising, if you will. Going from 27 sets to 3 sets, so 1/9 of their previous volumes, they did see a pretty notable decrease in mean fiber area of the vastus lateralis, a decrease of about 7%. Interestingly, the group that decreased to 1/3, so they did 9 sets per week, actually saw a nominally greater decrease in mean fiber area. And then that was kind of flipped for DEXA, right? So again, depending on the metric they used here, things were not super clear. But, if you look at the DEXA results, they were around a 3% decrease in the 1/3 group and around a 2% increase in the 1/9 group that trained with 3 sets per week. So to sum it up for older folks, it seems that the 1/3 and 1/9 volumes were just a little bit less effective than they were in the older folks. I think that's probably just due to the fact that older folks might require a little bit more dosage to see a given response. And thus, if you put them in the exact same study design and you have the exact same dosages, their ability to maintain muscle size with a given dosage is going to decrease. So, somewhere in that 3 to 9 set range, I would say for the older folks was at best able to maintain the adaptations they got, and at worst might have just attenuated their loss of muscle if they had ceased to train. Okay, I have a couple other studies I want to quickly note here, just because they're kind of unique in this maintenance volume discussion. But I'll pause here and see if, Zach, you think there's anything worth clarifying before I wrap up.
I don't think so. I think keep tracking, and then once we get to kind of through the main stuff, we can go back and forth a little bit.
Sweet. The next study I want to mention is one from Braz and colleagues. They used really high volumes, and they also used trained folks. This one is titled, I think it's from 2022 or 2023. It's titled Muscle Architecture and Strength Changes Induced by Different Resistance Training Frequencies and Detraining. So they had 27 folks, again, previously trained. This was a shorter study, but again, used trained folks and very high volumes. They actually trained for 48 sets per week for 4 weeks, just in the leg extension. So how's that for some monotony? And as you'd expect, saw some pretty good muscle growth there from those 4 weeks. And one of the conditions in this study that I'll highlight decreased from 48 to 24 sets per week for 4 weeks. And basically, there were no significant differences in a ton of different sites that they measured. They measured the rectus femoris, the vastus lateralis, the vastus intermedius, and the vastus medialis. And in most, if not all of those sites, they had, or sorry, most, if not all of those muscles, they had multiple sites. So there's a ton of data, and again, like each of those individual data points often don't agree in terms of directionality. But if I recall correctly, none of the changes from week 4 to week 8 were significant for whatever that's worth. And I think just kind of subjectively, my takeaway from this is that going from 48 to 24 in these trained folks was sufficient to maintain muscle size. And there was even a site or two that were pretty promising in terms of potentially reflecting a bit of muscle growth. Lastly, I will highlight a study from, I believe it's pronounced Trapi and colleagues. I believe this is out of Ball State, if I recall correctly. This is an older study, but it's a very long study. It's titled Maintenance of Whole Muscle Strength and Size Following Resistance Training in Older Men. The average age here was 75, and it was a small sample study. They had 10 men train leg extension with 9 sets for 12 weeks, and they saw pretty robust growth. And half of them, so 5 of them, reduced their volume to 1/3 of what they were doing previously, and thus did 3 sets per week. And they did that for 6 months. So again, this is a helpful study because it's so long, and muscle size basically stayed the same. The percentage change was minus 0.7. So more or less, they were able to maintain the growth they got from 12 weeks of training by just doing 3 sets per week. And then there's also a study from, I believe it's in Tunis and colleagues, in older women as opposed to older adults in the Trapi study, but I'm not going to rehash that one because it's pretty similar in terms of training design. So the last study I'll highlight is Zach's in-house meta-analysis that you can find on our website, where he analyzed a good amount of these studies I mentioned above, and also some case studies specifically of tapers and powerlifters, because a taper is basically a period of reduced training volume. So if they measured muscle size, you can get some insight into maintenance volumes. Granted, it's smaller time scales, but nonetheless provides some interesting insight. And Zach, you can obviously correct me if I'm wrong, but basically his takeaway was, for the most part, it seems like if you reduce volume to about 33% of what you were doing previously, there's a good shot of maintaining muscle size. Now, I think there's a pretty big limitation to saying, hey, if you drop to 33% of previous volumes, you're going to maintain muscle size. Like, that just doesn't cover a lot of scenarios, because there obviously has to be some sort of role of absolute volumes. If you were to drop from, 3 sets to 1 set, is that going to be sufficient to maintain muscle size? Whereas if you go from 30 sets to 10 sets, I'd say it's probably more likely to maintain muscle size. So again, from a kind of subjective view of the research, I would summarize all this stuff that I've just rambled on about as somewhere around 3 to 10 sets per week seems to reliably maintain muscle size. And I think there's probably some interplay of previous volumes. And if we were to do it based on relative volumes, I'd say 33% is probably sufficient in most scenarios, but 50% of previous volumes is probably safer and covers a little bit more scenarios. So that will kind of set the stage for, I think, a little bit more nuanced discussion when we kind of take a step back and think about conceptualizing how maintenance volumes fit into our general understanding of the dose-response relationship between volume and muscle size, different timescales that some studies did or didn't look at, and also beyond that, other lifestyle factors outside of a controlled lab environment, et cetera. So with that summary out of the way, with those numbers that people were probably waiting for me to finally say there, with those on the table, Zach, do you generally agree? Anything you would kind of push back on or any color to add?
Yeah, I went back and just took a peek at the article that we have. It makes me want to revisit this stuff because I think there's definitely a couple interesting angles we could pull on here. I think the way that I counted volume was challenging, if I recall. Sometimes it had to be like volume load, and it was challenging to get some of the programs. And then also, I don't think I could have necessarily accounted for the duration of the the period in which volume was decreased for. I think those are both things I could, with a fresh set of eyes now, probably collect that stuff a little bit better. And I wonder how that stuff would play out with a couple of these other studies that have come out recently. So yeah, it's an interesting conversation. I think from my perspective, the general chatter about this topic uses the Bickel study, which is a great study, but in much higher confidence than I think it probably should. Not only because it's one study, and even if it wasn't the perfect population, et cetera, and the application that people are using it for, I think that would be a limitation. But more importantly, I think the quote that I used in this article was like, people say, yeah, like this is a really good evidence you could maintain your muscle size on 1/9 your previous training volumes. And like I added like a bold text after it saying like, if you've been training progressively for like 1 year, and it's just a little bit, it's just obviously a limitation. I think the other thing that you mentioned is absolutely something that I think is crucial, is like, this is probably a whole nother topic in terms of like how to communicate results and findings on social media and stuff, but percentage changes have become very popular to communicate things. And I understand why that is intuitive and very easy for people to grasp. But we've talked about this a couple different times. Like, you can have a massive relative change with a very minute absolute difference. So I always view those two things as kind of partners with one another. Like, a percentage change is helpful if you don't have a ton of context for the units, but having confidence about anything when you don't have a really good understanding of the units is kind of hard to grasp. So yeah, I think the point you made about not just bucketing this as like a relative change in training volume is very, very important. Going from 50 sets to 25 sets is very different than going from 4 to 2 sets per week, despite those being equivalent relative changes. So yeah, I think if anything, kind of paints this conversation, it's just like, I think this is a very comforting story that people kind of try to convince themselves is kind of a neat, easy thing to kind of understand. Like, you can maintain a way less than what you started with, which I think is generally the case. But I think there is, like you said, a little bit more nuance that goes into this conversation about, interacting factors. What volumes are you training with in an absolute sense? What's your population? Those kind of things. So I think, long story short, it's probably more complicated than meets the eye, as a lot of things we discuss are.
Yeah, man. Thank you for mentioning the percentage change stuff, because that is, part of it is it would have taken a bunch of time to calculate the effect sizes, and not that much time, but I think that's important to highlight, and will help me sleep at night knowing that we addressed the fact that I just listed a bunch of percentage changes, even though that's probably not the best way to go about it. However, I didn't use like relative differences, at least, because that's where you can really have some fun with it, right?
The old double dip, baby. Let's go.
The double dip, right? You can say, okay, let me just find one really quick. Okay. Instead of saying that going from 27 sets to 9 sets, was more reliably maintained, more reliably maintained muscle, you could actually say, oh, dude, it actually doesn't even work, because one is in the negative direction, one is in the positive direction. All right, I'm not even going to go there. But you could say like you could say like a 1,000% difference.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, you could say like a 0.02 centimeter gain in muscle size is 100% better than a 0.01 gain in muscle size, right?
Yeah. So yeah, that's important to mention. And also, I like tabulated all of the data in a way that was helpful for me to kind of look at it for this question from the Braz study, because they had so many different sites. I think I
was looking at my article. That's what it was about initially. I'm just like, oh, dude, this is a nightmare.
Yeah. Look, they did rectus femoris proximal, rectus femoris distal, vastus medialis proximal, vastus medialis distal, vastus intermedius proximal, vastus intermedius distal lateral, vastus intermedius distal medial, vastus lateralis, proximal
I
vastus
must have just
lateralis
averaged
distal.
those because I only have 4 on the site.
Yeah, so I mean, listen, man, like I actually think that's phenomenal. I think if you're doing the ultrasound assessment and you can entertain the participant, you should get as many sites as you can. I'm all for that. But I think this is obviously a sidebar from the main topic here, but this is a good example of how I could take any one of these sites, and if they happen to have only measured and reported one of these sites, or better yet, they measure all of them and only report one. That would really be, that'd be triple dipping. You can get into some wild stuff, and this is just us going on about the limitations of research because of all of those different sites of the Braz study. And again, I think some of these measurements have to be in millimeters, which is really small. I don't think some of these would make sense to be in centimeters. I'd have to double check the manuscript, but
I wrote millimeters, yeah.
okay, cool. So like some of them are like a 20% increase during that 4-week maintenance period. Some of them, one of them is a 20% increase. One of them is what's the smallest negative percentage change? -6%, right? So again, another lesson in, I guess this would be like, just like to some degree, sampling variability and small sample research. And percentage changes, I think, are helpful for the listener to understand the directionality of stuff. But it's important to have the concepts and be very, very wary of relative percentages because that's double dipping. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, I just think I don't want to turn into an entire interpretation episode. This is actually just making me think of another YouTube video to do. But yeah, it's just like I think a lot of this stuff could be solved if people are getting way better at reporting some type of unit of measurement error, and you can convert those measurement errors into percentage like equivalents if you wanted to. And so I think that takes a 100% difference in muscle size or whatever and makes it look a lot less glaring if you say your measurement error is compatible with like 75% difference or something like that. So yeah, it's just a old man
And
being grumpy.
well, I also want to be clear that like we're not in the camp of pointing these things out and saying, oh, they don't matter. Why would you even consider training with high volumes? Why would you even consider training with long muscle lengths? Like pulling up a ruler and trying to point out like how small these differences are. Like, yeah, we acknowledge those things, but I would honestly take the stance of like a lot of these small effects do matter. It's just hard to detect, and just due to all of this variability we're mentioning, you just have to be cautious with it. And it's more so like I think a lot of things do matter. I have a lot of like skepticism around like the evidence-based rep ranges. I have a lot of skepticism around some of the proximity to failure research, not in the sense that like it's wrong or anything, but it's just like I think a lot of things matter more than people give credit to because there's quote unquote no significant difference. And I think we should, when things consistently lean in one direction, probably adopt it so long as the potential positives outweigh the negatives. So I just want to add that clarification. That could have came off as like
I think this is another thing where it's just like an interpretation perspective. This is something that isn't always explicitly made clear. Like you can interpret research with a different effect size that you consider sufficient for like intervening in practice, right? Like two people could read a paper, and particularly when you take into account cost benefit, and one person could say it's worth intervening, and the other person could say it isn't. And like that, those are both totally fine. It's quite literally a subjective determination there. But like I think typically, based on the clients we serve and the way that we view this stuff, for the most part, for pretty much anything that doesn't have a high cost associated with it, if there is conceivable benefit, we're going to take that bet pretty much every day of the week. Particularly if it's something that shows an effect that's meaningful relative to like measurement error. Like I'm saying, like that to me is like a gold standard of like someone like us who views these neutral to positive effects as like pretty good evidence of most things. Like if something is resulting in an effect that in an absolute sense to somebody who maybe isn't willing to jump at many neutral positive effects. Like, I think that's fine. That's a fine interpretation. But like, I also think it's fine to have, hey, pretty much anything that's important to me, so long as we can say it's not compatible with just like random noise, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, I don't know. That's a whole, again, just a whole nother conversation
But nah,
on
bro.
interpreting
Nah, bro.
things. But
You can maximize your gains at maintenance forever.
definitely.
Definitely. Well, I think maintenance is a great option for some folks, but I just have some thoughts there. But we're gonna stop. All right. Let's go back to maintenance volumes. Um, okay. Which of these possibilities is more likely? Option A, I think, is, if I had to guess, the more common way this is represented and probably interpreted by folks in kind of our space. And that is that there is kind of this large maintenance range, right? As long as I do like 1/9 to 1/3, or maybe 1/9 to 40% or 50%, whatever, of what I was doing before, I'm going to maintain. And then the dose response begins. So, in other words, you kind of have, like, if you were to consider the dose response relationship, it would basically be like flat for a while, right? And then the dose response begins. Honestly, I think that's probably, like, I kind of say that out loud, and I think you kind of get where I'm going at with this discussion here. That I don't think that's right, but I think that's how a lot of people interpret it. Um, or what I think is more likely, and Zach, you can let me know if you agree with me, is that the few studies we have on maintenance volumes just haven't resulted in like significant growth. So like, you have some that are like slightly positive, some that are slightly negative. And instead of just saying, oh, non-significant changes, therefore you have this large maintenance range before the dose response relationship begins, when you start thinking about the dose response studies with higher volumes. Instead, what I guess I'm proposing here is that maintenance volumes are a stop along the way of the dose response relationship, right? So you still have a dose response relationship. Maybe for someone I take off the street that's never trained before, that dose response relationship starting at one set is positive. But for you or me, it's probably going to be negative, right? Or for someone that's trained for, is trained for twice as long as we have, maybe that's even more negative. And the idea is that this dose response relationship is a dose response relationship. Maintenance is a stop along the way. There's got to be a point where that dose response relationship crosses an effective zero. For some folks, it's going to be lower volumes than other folks. And the reason that you might consider it, or you might conceptualize, or you might interpret what some folks are saying regarding maintenance as just this big range, is just because it's, if you're dichotomizing findings as significant or non-significant, you kind of interpret it as no change, whereas in fact there's probably a true underlying dose response relationship that we just, with, like, I don't know, 4 to 6 studies in the area, can't truly inform what that looks like. What do you think?
Yeah, 100%. Like, I think even if you just think about the concept of like, okay, just think about your muscle size. Let's say we had this little magic device that could measure it in reality, right? And I think if you just think about the definition of maintenance, it also just kind of becomes something that, like, you can't really think in this categorical fashion. Like, it just doesn't really make sense. Like, the probability that you're exactly maintaining muscle size at all times is probably pretty low. It's probably changing in either direction to a small degree, either or. And you could consider maintenance within some buffer. Like, you could define maintenance as that. But I think if you just kind of think about it that way, like, it exposes that, hey, this is probably more of like this graded phenomenon rather than I'm growing or I'm not growing. And then the second I hit 10 sets, now I'm magically growing at an appreciable rate. Like, it just conceptually doesn't make sense. Like, pretty much everything biology operates in these graded relationships that are attenuating at greater, faster rates depending on the context. But like, yeah, just like pretty much every physiological law operates in these threshold kind of principles that I think, you have these graded dose response relationships. And then in our case, when you like actually notice something is going to be considerably farther down the chain than when you may actually be, making a change in muscle size in either direction underneath the hood. And that's just another pro research kind of situation. That's why we use the tools that we do to try to extrapolate those into practical time periods and stuff. Like, again, just don't want to belabor that point too much, but yeah, I think like the kind of threshold maintenance or the categorical maintenance model of like, hey, 0 to 0 or 1 to whatever people say, like 6 sets or whatever is a maintenance zone. I don't think that's a good way to think about it, really. I think that potentially discourages people from doing things that would definitely make sense in a lot of scenarios, and also just puts potentially false confidence in cases where I wouldn't want to do that, right? Like, if you take it from the perspective of like, hey, somebody who's training with 16 sets per week and doing really high quality training, but their schedule gets substantially more busy. Maybe they were training with a good amount of RAR and maybe some exercises that aren't the most quote unquote stimulus per set or whatever. We switch them over to training a little bit closer to failure, maybe some more kind of shotgun exercises, and drop their volume down to 5-6 sets per week per muscle group. So that's all they have time for. That could be a totally reasonable thing to do. Whereas in another case, if someone thinks, hey, if I'm in this zone, automatically I will maintain muscle, that may also not be the case if they're an elite bodybuilder that typically trains with 36 sets per muscle group for the muscles that they're specializing in their off season. And they also have a change in something, their lifestyle, and they drop down to 2 or 3 sets per muscle group. I don't think it's reasonable to tell that person that they're going to maintain every ounce of muscle. So I think that kind of categorical way of thinking, or that on-off switch, black and white kind of method of attack there, I think creates quite a few issues in both directions. Whereas a graded approach, understanding things operate in these kind of, it depends kind of line of thinking, I think is just probably more accurate and leads to better decision making in most cases.
Yeah, I love the way you framed that. Like basically shifting from categorical thinking to graded thinking or continuous thinking, right? Actually, one of the practical takeaways I have here. Oh wait, no, maybe that was when I was working on a YouTube video. That was going to be my practical takeaway. But it's to avoid all or nothing thinking, right? Or avoid black and white, avoid this categorical thinking in the sense of like, I'm either locked in, going to grow as much as I can this block, this month, this season, this year, or I'm going to maintain and, hang out in this maintenance range. Both of those are great options, but they're both just stops along the way, in my view. And I think you can take a graded response. I think you can take a graded response session by session. I think you can take a graded response week by week, month by month, semester by semester for a student, whatever the case may be. And I think that's probably one of the biggest takeaways here. I have a couple of thought experiments that I want to go through, but before we get to that, let's pause a little bit on this difference between absolute maintenance volumes. Again, I'm kind of speaking about it categorically, even though we've acknowledged it's probably not the best way to go about it, but bear with me. Absolute maintenance volumes versus relative maintenance volumes. My question for you, Zach, is do you think the relative change matters at all? So, like, in other words, do you think that I think what this boils down to is like, do you think, okay, let me take a step back. I'm kind of thinking through this as I go. Let's say 5 sets per session, 5 sets per week maintains volume for someone that was recently doing 20. Do you think that changes in another person that was recently doing 40? Or do you think the absolute volume is all that matters?
I don't think it's all that matters, but I do think the absolute volume is the predominant factor, if I had to guess. Um, I always, so these kind of thought experiments and like put your money where your mouth is kind of questions, I usually try to rely for things I don't have like immediate evidence to pull on, obviously. I try to go to like medicine kind of correlates, and where my head goes
Or
is,
optometry.
yeah, of course, obviously that's my secondary area of expertise. Um, I'm just thinking like blood pressure medication, right? If I have someone on a very, very high dose of blood pressure medication, I would expect their blood pressure to remain suppressed if they're on a non-zero dose of the medication. It's just probably not going to be suppressed to the extent that it should be for that individual. So they may habituate to the medication to some degree, but I think they would still receive a benefit of the medication despite it being a substantially lower relative dose. So in the training example, I think there's likely habituation to higher training volumes in some capacity. I don't even know what the mechanisms there would be, whether it's from an energy perspective, some sort of metabolism oriented kind of adaptation that maybe is in some way modifying the stimulus that you're receiving. I'm honestly not sure. I'd have to think about that more, but I do think that the absolute volume is probably the thing that matters the most. And then there's a minor interacting effect between the relative change that I think probably is an adaptive quality. So by that, I mean, if you spend some more time at lower doses, man, I just came across resensitization on accident. There you go. I do think that effect would probably go away after a while. If I'm, again, relying kind of on the medical example of take somebody on a very high dose of blood pressure medication, they go back down to a much lower dose. I would expect their blood pressure to stay relatively suppressed relative to unmedicated, but over time, they would be resensitized to that medication such that if they went on a higher dose again, they'd probably receive the rate modifier. That would be my guess.
Yeah, you you've just kind of just, that's welcome to my brain and how I'm trying to like think through these things, because like I kind of want it to just be absolute volumes, like that is just so much prettier. Um, I just I just have a hard time believing that's the case based on other, you know, parallel examples, like you mentioned blood pressure medication. I think another example is like caffeine. Again, totally different ways that training works on your body compared to how uh, caffeine impacts the various effects you feel from it. But nonetheless, I think there's something there. So I think it's both. And we're basically coming at this concept of resensitization from the opposite angle that we did in our last episode, or maybe it's 2 episodes ago, because we were talking about resensitizing kind of like in the sense of adding stimulus. In this case, it's reducing stimulus. Does that change the effects of an absolute volume? All things held equal. So I guess the takeaway that I'd propose, and Zach, you can let me know if you agree with this, is that the absolute maintenance volume is probably the primary thing, with like a secondary effect of the relative change. Do you think that's fair?
Yeah, that's where my intuition goes. I'm trying to think through um, these studies that we have in powerlifters to like recall some limitations that I might not have thought of initially, but there were some pretty big decreases in muscle size with um, training volumes that I would expect would maintain. Um, some of those could be measurement related situation, could be, tapering is a unique type of detraining. Like if you were to measure the rate of muscle loss, I would imagine it's much faster at the beginning of a detraining period, and that might even stabilize a little bit after some sort of fluid normalization. I don't know. That's honestly something I should think more about before saying it, but that's what the podcast is for, half baked thoughts. So those could be potentially maybe inflated a little bit in terms of how much muscle loss we see. And they just like looking at the distribution of changes that they do seem a little bit to be outliers with the really, really large negative changes. So yeah, I think other than resensitization though, I don't know if I can really have support for why the relative change would matter. I guess, is really what it hinges upon. So if I'm thinking about what would convince me otherwise, is like I can't really think of a reason why the relative change would matter other than resensitization having some role. Is that your perception?
Yeah. You're saying beyond like any sort of transient shifts in things that could show up on a measure of whole muscle size, like, changes in glycogen, changes in water, i.e., edema slash swelling. Is that you're saying like kind of put those aside?
Yeah, put the
Resensitization
logistic.
would be the only thing explaining it.
Yeah, put the logistics aside. Like the only thing I could think of that would explain my intuition of why that may matter is that. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I think I agree. Um, However, this actually leads nicely into the first of two quick like thought experiments I want to go through before we wrap up. The first is that like how this changes based on other factors, and I'll lump other factors together. So when I say other factors, I'd even say like the inherent responsiveness of the individual. Like let's just grant the fact that person A just responds better to a given dosage than person B. Also lumped in there would be training age. Presumably, someone that's been training hard for 10 years isn't going to grow from one set, but someone that's untrained could. A calorie deficit, right? So at a given dosage, you're probably going to see worse muscle growth. I'd also put low sleep, high stress. Again, these are probably all going to attenuate your response to any previous, or sorry, any given dosage. So the way that I think about this is like everything we just talked about was kind of in the context of like a parallel universe with the same exact person. But I think you might see different, like, I think you might see this play out differently based on some of these other factors. And the way that I've conceptualized this recently is that it just kind of shifts the dose response curve up or down, right? Maybe the dose response curve itself changes, especially at higher volumes, but maybe that's more due to practical reasons. But if it does, I'd have to imagine the dose response curve isn't all that different between folks. But these factors, including, again, just inherent response and training age, calorie deficit, sleep, etc., that would just shift things, right? So if you had everything working against you, you've been training for 30 years, you're sleeping 4 hours a night, you're super stressed out, you're trying to cut as well. Maybe you were also training with 40 sets a week and you reduce to 10 sets a week, that might not be sufficient to maintain muscle size. But if you take someone on the other end of that spectrum, they've been training for 6 months, they're in a surplus, they're sleeping well, their stress is managed, and they were previously training with 20 sets, and now they go down to 10 sets, they'll potentially would still grow, right? Then you also have to factor in the inherent response to the individual. So anyway, all these other factors, the way that I think about it is just kind of shifts that curve up or down. Does that check out to you?
Yeah, I think for the most part, I think trying to think of a counter, and it would basically have to modify the mechanisms of how training works directly, um, which for the most things I'm looking on your list, I don't think it would per se. Um,
Yeah.
Calorie deficit may be the only one I could think of.
Hmm.
That a severe enough deficit, you would just not have um, the substrates to support like growth that would be associated with very high volumes, for example. Um,
Mm.
but yeah, mostly speculation. You could literally take the exact opposite position on that and say the higher volume stimulus is the thing that would allow you to maintain muscle given that. And I know there's people that advocate for higher volumes in a deficit. So it's we have that one study on that, but I can't recall the exact design, but I think that there was a little bit to be desired with that. But ultimately, yeah, I think that's a relatively safe assumption. I think that's probably the simplest kind of Occam's razor kind of situation.
Yeah. So, I don't love doing this sort of thing. I kind of mentioned in the research somewhere between 3 to 10 sets. as an absolute volume seems to work out in terms of maintaining muscle size. Now, most of those studies were previously untrained folks before like their initial bout of resistance training. So I'd say maybe closer to the upper end of that for the
It's probably
average like
graded.
listener here. It's probably graded exactly. So like I don't know. I think 3 to 10 is still decent. But if just kind of think through some of those things I mentioned. Do you seem to need pretty high dosages to grow, or are you kind of the type of person that grows pretty well from anything and you haven't really had much trouble growing in the first place? Are you in a surplus? Are you in a deficit? How are outside of gym factors? Those might make it so you can maintain. Again, I don't want to talk about it categorically, but for the purposes of conversation here, maintain with 3 to 5 sets. And then again, don't think about it categorically. Think about it continuously, because if you are training with 20 sets and you go to 5 to 10, in that case, you might still grow, and you might as well, because that'll add up. Now, let me quickly run this by you. Let's say you have a very high level natural bodybuilder training for 25 years, and they cut their volume to 50%. Is that individual going to maintain their physique?
I think this just exposes how much I think the absolute volume matters. Because I'm just thinking, if they're a 12 set a week kind of person, they drop it to 6. I don't think it'll be noticeable. I think they'll lose some, but I don't think it'd be necessarily noticeable. But if they're a 30 set a week person and they drop it to 15, I just have such a hard time believing they're maintaining that. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm wrong, but
you think if they were doing 30 and they go to 15, they'd be less likely than someone going from say 10 to 5?
Opposite.
Oh, okay, okay.
I think if they're at 30 and they go to 15, I think they're probably losing quite a bit. Whereas if they did did I say the wrong thing? Am I backwards?
Now you're confusing me. So if let's say these are the two top natural bodybuilders in the world. One was training with 12 sets on average. One was training with 30 sets. And one of them went to 6 sets.
I see the issue. I think the person with a greater absolute change there would be more likely to lose muscle.
Change, not the new absolute volume.
Correct. Yeah,
damn, that's like a third factor I didn't really consider.
Yeah, I guess the way that I'm thinking about it is, if there's somebody who presumably is in the sport for a while, presumably has self-selected themselves to find the training that seems to quote unquote work best for them, and they're at 30 sets, and you remove 15 of those sets, that seems like a bad deal.
Even to just maintain.
Yeah, I don't. This is literally just total gut reaction. Something there just doesn't sit right to me. Whereas the person who's doing 12 and they only decrease their set count by 6 seems like a safer bet to me.
Yeah. I see where you're coming from. My initial knee jerk was the opposite of ultimately what you landed on. I think something that kind of confounds it is if we are assuming, this extreme example of the most jacked natural lifter in the world, they're probably not someone that requires high dosages to grow, and thus going from 30 to 15.
But would they at that training age though? All right.
I don't know, man. I feel like 30 to 15 is kind of an extreme example, because I feel like 30 direct sets is pretty dang high. I think that's pretty dang high. So 30 to 15, I'd have a hard time believing they wouldn't maintain. But if you take someone that's been training for 10 years and, struggles to grow, maybe their life isn't optimized around it, and they go from 30 to 15, then I could see your argument.
The immediate example I have is my bench experience. I guess it's hard for me to separate it from strength to some degree, but
yeah,
my peak benching era, I've definitely lost upper body size from that, and I'm doing roughly half. Now, I would say with better execution, more hypertrophy focused, I don't know. That's probably a little bit of
But
anecdote there, but yeah.
but I know when you made that run and you benched like, well, whatever it was, like 330, something really impressive. You set everything up so you could go hit those PRs, like from a lifestyle perspective.
Oh, 100%. Yeah, there's a lot of confounding
So
factors. A lot of confounding factors
and
for sure.
and like, those things just get harder. Those things get harder with time. And I think there is kind of this positive feedback loop that can occur when things are kind of optimized, right? So that's kind of like a confounder here in this whole maintenance discussion, is like, if you're thinking of it categorically, and I'm not saying you were doing this, Zach, but like, if you do think about it categorically as like, I'm either trying to grow right now, I'm going to set everything up, including train with high volumes, and also my lifestyle isn't designed to support, or sorry, and my lifestyle is designed to support training. That's going to be a nice little positive feedback loop. Whereas if you kind of pull back and all things aren't held equal and your lifestyle isn't in the spot to support your training, that can really confound things. So that actually leads me to our first of, I think it'll be 3 takeaways. And that is that lifestyle maintenance may be just as important, or potentially even more important, than all of these dosage details that we've talked about for maintaining muscle size. The second takeaway is that I think progressive training works, right? And I don't think you should think of it categorically as maintenance volume versus optimal volume or productive volume. I think you should view it as, hey, training is going to work. I could train with such low volumes that I'm really just attenuating a loss of muscle. Maybe I'm around maintenance with some error bars around that. Or I could do just less progressive training that still grows muscle, but it's not at an optimal rate, which I think most people actually do. Most people are really not training optimally, and I think that's okay. And I think we should be more willing to accept that. And if you're doing that, progress might be hard to detect or notice in the short to moderate term, which I think also is important when stepping away from categorical thinking. Because if you're not, quote unquote, optimizing things, maybe you are reducing your workload. You might just gain muscle at a slower rate. It might be harder to see over a 6 to 12 month period, but like that doesn't mean it won't add up, right? You poke your head up 5 years later and your physique is transformed, even though you are training with half of the volumes before, because again, progressive training works so long as you're like in the positive part of that dose response relationship. And that leads to the final takeaway, is that more than likely our opinion is that maintenance volumes are probably a stop along the dose response curve. I think it's helpful to discuss maintenance volumes in terms of discussion and like what we mean by what we're saying, but I don't think it's this big maintenance, this big maintenance area before you actually enter the dose response curve. And then that dose response curve might depend on your aptitude, or aptitude's a weird word to use there, your just general responsiveness to training, your biological age, your training age, your lifestyle, which includes whether you're cutting, whether you're bulking, and a lot of other factors. So hopefully we took that theoretical discussion, made it pretty practical. And Zach, I'll kick it to you to add anything else and close this out.
Oh, Christian, man, I thought that was a good one. I definitely have some thoughts to come away with on that one that I didn't necessarily think about coming in. So I always like that. I enjoyed the podcast for that reason, and hopefully the listeners enjoy it as well. And if you did, be sure to leave a 5-star rating and review on your podcast player of choice. As always, we take Q&A questions, usually on Instagram. I don't think we did for this podcast, but be sure to leave your questions there. We'll get to them in a future episode. And yeah, without further ado, we'll see you on the next episode. Take care.